This thing's so light.
Uh-huh. I mean, and that's pretty much a fact. Like, I mean, I built it, but it's all Noveski parts. Like, you know, that's actually a stainless barrel. I just Cerakoted it. But yeah, I mean, it's, and this suppressor is, you know, a good deal lighter.
That's I like that a 9mm suppressor works on subsonic.
I know, right?
So quiet. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I might like. You got an LMT bolt in there? Yeah, I wouldn't change a thing, man. Went too fast. It's 100 yards. That.
Well, hello there.
Hello.
And as you can probably tell from the intro, today we're going to talk about golfing.
The fuck is this?
Obviously, you're not a golfer.
I fielded a question recently, and quite frankly, I was trying to figure out where to start my content up after the break. And thank God for people's questions, right? I've fired enough suppressed weapons over the years to offer a little insight on the topic. There are people that, like me when I first started, didn't have any experience because of where I used to live, and then I moved to Texas and was able to rent some and was thinking, man, I really want to get into this, but I was close to transferring, so I didn't purchase any suppressors. Plus, at the time, there were few NFA people out there that were wanting other people to get into it. It was kind of like an elite club. And then as more YouTube channels came out and more people showed off NFA items like SBRs, suppressors, all that good stuff, people started really getting into it. So I moved here with my orders. I started doing the same, but in the process I've fired a lot of suppressed rifles and handguns, as well as some PDWs in there. Now I will say part of this video is going to be sharing my insight and what I've experienced and what I know to be true from shooting and all the experience I got, plus the people that gave me the ability to run their stuff and gain some knowledge, as well as share some insights with me so I don't fall into the pitfalls that a new suppressor user would fall into. I'm also doing this video to combat some of the absolute nonsense out there, because I've heard some of the dumbest things I've ever heard, and you can tell these people are just parroting things that they hear out of context, or some such thing that doesn't apply to rifles, but it applies to pistols, but they say it in the context of a rifle. And you'll ask them, like, how many suppressors do you have? And they're like, they just stay quiet. Before I jump into it though, I would first like to say I've been absolutely blessed in my life. I've had the best people around me to allow me to shoot their stuff, invite me to their ranges, expend their ammunition shooting their guns, and be genuine friends who I wouldn't be in this position without. First, Eric from Firearm Tutorials. He was very heavily featured in the intro. He allowed me to shoot a lot of his stuff and things that I would never have been able to even put my hands on or eyes on in a gun shop, like a UMP 45. He let me shoot my Mark 23 suppressed. He let me shoot a menagerie of things suppressed, to include a bolt action, all sorts of stuff. He gave me a lot of opportunities I wouldn't have otherwise had. And he's a really good dude. One of the few people that you see online and they act the exact same way that they do on their YouTube channel. Just a genuinely nice guy to be around. Florida Man HVACR allowed me to shoot not only his 13.7, but a 13.7 with a SIG suppressor that I know I would not have been able to find or use otherwise, since there's not a whole lot of them out there and not a lot of people are running them because that particular suppressor is discontinued. But his setup was really nice to shoot and he was very gracious in letting me shoot that. My buddy Hazmat, or Double Action, whichever one I think he's Hazmat on YouTube and Double Action somewhere else, I don't remember, but I always forget. I don't want to use the guy's real name, obviously, but he allowed me to shoot his Triarch 12.5 with an RC2 before mine came home. My buddy with his LMT allowed me to shoot his 11.5 LMT SBR with a Surefire RC2 to get me hooked on suppressors and to shoot the RC2 first. My buddy with the Triarch let me shoot his while mine was in NFA jail. And my buddy with the LMT, who later gave me this 10.5 LMT, who I'm forever indebted to for a multitude of reasons, really good guy also, he let me shoot his RC2 and he let me shoot a bunch of other setups, which I'm very thankful for. He let me shoot his BCM, I think it's a 9.5 or 10.5 inch 300 blackout with an RC2 for 300 black. Eric from Firearm Tutorials let me shoot his 300 blackout guns. And, you know, I really want to thank all these guys because I wouldn't have had this opportunity or knowledge on my own. And I think it's really important to both reflect on how important friends are and being cool in the gun community and getting people into things and allowing them to shoot your stuff. It's a really nice experience and it's really rewarding now that I've been able to do it in their absence, or, you know, schedules not lining up or whatever, but I've been able to do it for other people. And then my other buddy, unfortunately his Instagram is his name, so I don't want to use that necessarily, but he allowed me to shoot his Block 2 suppressed. So I also want to thank him, and he's also a very upstanding dude, and that dude can shoot. .99. But all great dudes, wouldn't be here without them. Now, I do want to say this isn't going to be a which suppressor I think is best or what suppressors I like. I'll do that at a later junction, but right now I just want to focus on suppressing stuff and what I've experienced, and some points, tackle some misconceptions, all that good stuff. By no means is this an exhaustive review of every platform or suppressor I've ever used. I've not fired 6.5 Creedmoor suppressed, your favorite Wildcat round suppressed. I fired a 308, maybe 5 total rounds suppressed. That was Eric's Ruger that he had a suppressor on. And yeah, I don't make 338 money or suppress 50 cal money. All right, so you want to suppress your pistol or AR-15, lots of options and things to consider. Recoil movement off centerline, recoil impulse, common misconceptions, recoil system tuning, adjustable gas blocks, and muzzle device selection. That's what we're gonna hit today. So as my camera begs to let me just allow it to die and get a new one, we have to define some terms real quick, which isn't really gonna be too fun, but
Oh, come on, stop whining.
One of the common misconceptions in the discussion for suppressors in general is the term recoil. Now, the two things I'm going to differentiate, because it's important, especially when talking about suppressors, is recoil movement of the muzzle or your sights or whatever off center line, which is I'm aiming here, that's my point of aim, point of impact. When I press the shot, the muzzle comes up or my optic moves or whatever. That is going to be recoil movement off of center line. So any recoil movement that the gun is going to do with a handgun or a rifle or a PDW or whatever that you're unable to mitigate, that is recoil off center line. Then there's something called the recoil impulse, and that's what you feel into your hands or into your shoulder. Now again, some people view these things as different. So there's going to be people just talk about general recoil. I have to differentiate that because you're dealing with an explosion that takes place and something cycling, all right? I've not shot a Nagant revolver, so we're here talking about semi-automatic pistols and semi-automatic rifles. There's going to be something that happens here because it's a semi-automatic system. When that happens, it's going to generate a recoil impulse. You'll also get a recoil impulse from a bolt action, but it's a little different. So I want to focus on the difference between the two because people will combine them as they talk, and sometimes they'll be like, that's kickback, or that's whatever stupid term, I don't care, but we do need to differentiate the two for this discussion. Sorry, I know that was annoying and boring.
That was terrible.
Common misconceptions or myths. The first one I want to tackle is adding a suppressor to anything makes it smoother. This is not the case. I've heard arguments where people will say my pistol always shoots better with a suppressor, and then you shoot it and you can feel the cycle of operations where you couldn't necessarily feel them before because there's increased back pressure into the pistol. Some pistols suppress better than others. There's a wide host of posts online about what good suppressor hosts are. P226, Beretta 92, HKs. There's a lot of good suppressor hosts out there. Some guys like 1911s, although not all 1911s will suppress very well. But there's a wealth of information out there on what a good suppressor host is. And then there are some poor ones. With rifles, there's some rifles you can't suppress. And the flow-through technology has allowed systems that don't suppress well to now have the option to suppress because they needed a specifically tuned suppressor. And we've been lucky enough to live in this age where there's been a rapid evolution in suppressor technology to facilitate these things. So you have flow-through suppressors, you even have flow-through pistol suppressors from Huxworks. Now, my opinions on Huxworks aside, the ability to suppress those platforms that once did not suppress well is quite nice. So we're talking AKs and other platforms where you can't really regulate the gas too well, and if you put, say, a Surefire suppressor on a Tavor, it'll fuck it up. But if you run a OSS can on a Tavor, it runs. So those are possibilities, but just throwing a suppressor on a Tavor does not make it shoot smoother. In fact, it'll self-destruct unless it's an OSS suppressor.
No! No! This is not how this was supposed to go!
So I've heard this argument, and I think it's a misinterpreted Pew Science thing. I'm not sure. I'd have to check Pew Science to see if they actually said this, but I believe they were talking about a pistol can. Now, I'm not going to sit here and hold people that put out information properly and it's misconstrued later, because there's people that are going to hear the same words and interpret them differently.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
But there's an argument going around that on a rifle, pressure on the first baffle helps mitigate recoil. No. One, I don't even know how you would measure that. And this is recoil off a center line, obviously not recoil impulse or bolt speed or however you want to measure that. So with a pistol, you're going to have a piston which facilitates that sort of motion, and that's kind of where that comes from because the suppressor needs to carry forward while the pistol continues through its cycle of operations with the Browning action. So this barrel still needs to drop out of battery, unlock, extract, eject, and then feed, rechamber, lock, and continues shooting, right? I'm sure I fucked that up somewhere, but it unlocks before this barrel comes down. But in order to do that, you can't just hang a weight on the barrel because it will impede function, which is where the piston comes in, and why an MP5 doesn't need a piston because the barrel's fixed, right? Without getting too far gone in that, someone's taken that because there's additional movement outside of the gun to facilitate its operation where that does not happen with a rifle. And I don't know how you would even measure the pressure compensation on the front of the baffle coming back and balancing the rifle. All it does is increase your recoil impulse. Now, is it more likely that because of this weight that's added to the front of the gun that changes the recoil movement off of centerline? That's much more likely than the little increase in back pressure you're getting is keeping your muzzle flat. That doesn't make any damn sense. In fact, that story's best told with a muzzle brake, because it's not that the front of the muzzle brake is closed that mitigates the recoil. It's the giant ports on the side that mitigate the recoil. And when you put a suppressor on this, it drastically increases the back pressure versus other muzzle devices, not necessarily in the system. I think it's a high 1-digit, low 2-digit number, maybe between like 7 to 10% internal pressure increase from muzzle brake. Don't quote me on the exact number, but if you shoot a muzzle brake suppressed and you shoot the identical platform with a 4-prong or a 3-prong, you'll notice that there's more recoil impulse, not movement off of center line, but more recoil impulse because it's bouncing off of this, pushing it back into the system, increasing pressure. So I kind of understand where that argument came from, but it doesn't apply to rifles. But people talk about it like it does. It doesn't work like that.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
It's the weight of the can. It's keeping the muzzle flatter, much like a 4-ounce pistol light keeps your pistol a little flatter and easier to shoot flat. I also heard an argument, especially with AR-15s, that if you add a suppressor to a gun, that the recoil impulse is better without any modifications. That is a bold-faced lie. I don't understand, in a world where we have increased buffers, all this research and data, adjustable gas blocks, and all this other stuff, where that would be the case, where that argument is even remotely valid based on any sort of science or measurement or anything. Taking a rack grade M4, changing the muzzle device, and throwing a suppressor on it makes the recoil impulse worse. I have never seen in my entire life a situation where you do that and it somehow shoots smoother. That's never happened to anyone, especially with an AR-15. It's just not real. Now, if you want to talk a pistol, 100% on board with that. This Mark 23 is much more shootable with a suppressor on it, shoots flatter, shoots easier. I mean, you can put a light on it and the suppressor and it doesn't really move that much, whereas you shoot it just like this and you really have to drive the gun. I've seen that. Same thing, you know, across the board, really. But don't sit here and tell me that throwing a suppressor on a rifle is just gonna, oh, it's fine, it's better. No, it isn't.
Hey man, it's cool.
Moving off those myths and points, we're gonna push into recoil system tuning on a rifle. So keeping it with an AR-15 or an AR-10, you can watch your ejection pattern more often than not and see if you're overgassed. If it's throwing it forward, the case is coming out forward at the 1 o'clock, 12:30 is really bad, but 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, not quite at 3:30, 4 o'clock, you're knowing you're a little bit overgassed. So you need to change your buffer weight or think about an adjustable gas system, which are two of the ways that people can tune the gun. Now, gas port size on your barrel has found to have a contributing factor to how smooth something shoots in general, as well as how well it's going to suppress. If you have a gun with a terrible gas port, you're starting behind the curve and you're not going to have a good time. If you're building an AR-15 from the ground up with suppressing in mind, then there's absolutely, especially if you're running a dedicated suppressed, there's absolutely a gas port size in the barrel that's going to make things a lot easier for you. So this 11.5 is great because it has a .068 gas port and it shoots very smooth, and then when you throw a suppressor on it, there's not much change. Although this gun's kind of an oddity with it shoots very smooth, the recoil impulse is wonderful, but it still ejects kind of at a 230 with the suppressor on there. Ejects perfectly without, but still kind of has an overgas ejection pattern with the suppressor attached, despite having a very smooth recoil impulse. So the way to adjust it using buffers, and buffers are very important. There's a carbine buffer, an H0, an H1, 2, and 3. I think there's some H4s and H5s out there. There's also some A5 system. I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know the A5 system stuff, and it's a different animal because it's a rifle length spring, and the buffers that you associate with that are different. So I've had the most experience with carbine springs, so that's what I use, and my guns run pretty smooth. It is possible to tune without the A5 system. I'm not taking shots at the A5 system. I know some companies swear by them. Some guys really like them, some guys don't. I'm not taking shots at the A5. I just don't personally use it for my stuff. Another thing you can also use while we're on buffers that I forgot to mention is if your buffer's getting marred up really bad, then your carrier speed is too fast, which is overgassing of the system. It may shoot fine unsuppressed, but when you suppress it, it just starts beating the hell out of the buffer. So you need to up your buffer and spring weight. That said, the two systems that I've had the most success with are the Geisley Super 42 system and just generic H1, H2, H3 buffers within spec and Sprinko springs. My Knights armament had the Knights equivalent of an H2 with a Sprinko blue spring. I never shot that gun suppressed, but it shot very smoothly that way, and I had no issues. With this gun though, they recommend a Super 42 and an H3 out of the factory, and I ran it Super 42 H2 before with a suppressor and without, and it shot plenty smooth, but it wasn't quite right. Put the H3 in it and it was fine. So what I generally start with, and even on my 14.5, which is where I broke from the point, the URGI came from Geisley with an H1 Super 42, and I feel it's much better suppressed and unsuppressed with an H2 in there instead of the H1. What you want to do is shoot the rifle as is, and then start to diagnose both your ejection pattern and the recoil impulse. If you notice a severe recoil impulse while shooting suppressed, it's time to up the buffer weight and spring. With the Super 42 system, it's very easy. It takes the spring guessing out. So my suggestions with running a Sprinko spring and a standard buffer are going to be different than with the Super 42 system. So switching the URGI was just a buffer change. Honestly, it was a buffer weight change that I did on my own, but it was just a buffer change and I was off to the races. Whereas with this LMT here, I changed the buffer weight based on what my buddy ran to an H2 with a red spring, because an H2 with a blue spring was what he had it on, and he swapped it to a red spring just to tune it perfectly with the muzzle brake, and that was what it was. It shoots 55 grains suppressed and unsuppressed, and it doesn't move. It's a great shooting gun. Sometimes you can be in the ballpark with, say, a blue spring and an H2, and then just fine tune it with the spring. And if a red Sprinko spring isn't enough, then you can also up the buffer weight. I will say running an H3 with a red spring is something I would save for a really gassy Mark 18 or something like that. That's a lot of spring and a lot of buffer. You're really gonna have to have a gassy gun to run an H3 red spring, in my opinion. And even the LMT 10.5, which is known to be a little more aggressive, is tamed with the H2 and red spring. So just to give you some context and idea. Now moving on to adjustable gas blocks. Adjustable gas blocks are a little more aggressive method to changing your gas pressure, and it allows you to keep everything the way it is unsuppressed and get the same feeling suppressed more often than not by just letting off more gas up front. Some guys really like that. It doesn't necessitate changing any of the internals. It only is a quick gas setting. Now, I don't like it because anytime I've used it, I've only had it on the wrong setting. And I've had to stop shooting and figure it out and change it. Admittedly, they were all friends' guns. They weren't my guns, so I didn't really run into that issue. But I will say, with the exception of this LMT here that's perfectly dialed in, the best shooting 10.5 I've ever fired was Firearm Tutorials 10.5, which is in the intro. It's a Noveski with an adjustable gas block. So it has a suppressor setting and it has regular settings. You just dial it in and you're off to the races. And you can see in that shooting footage that the gun is not stressed at all and it shoots nice and flat and easy with very little recoil impulse. Ultimately, it's a very smooth and good option. Of the two, again, I prefer adjusting the internals because I'm either gonna, like this 11.5, I split, but my 14.5, I shoot dedicated suppressed with a suppressor. So my URGI is more often than not, I'd say about 80 to 90% of the time running with a suppressor. But adjustable gas blocks do give you options. I do not necessarily recommend running an adjustable gas block and modifying the internals because you can really undergas your gun, wear out your gas rings, and a few other not so fun things. But I really favor reliability, so that's why I mess with the carbine springs in the rear, and that's how I tune. How you do it might be different, and I'm not saying one way is better or not. I just like, hey, I'm just gonna change out my buffer and springs. It's more cost effective, and I don't have to worry about the adjustable gas block being on the wrong setting.
Yes.
But there are options out there, and I don't know the best ones for an adjustable gas block. Guys in the comments can, you know, let everyone know which is best because I'm not an expert in that field. But I can tell you that for the springs, I will blanket recommend a Super 42 setup or a Sprinko setup with the proper buffer weight. And Sprinko also makes A5 system or rifle length springs, so that's out there and available. And Geisley also makes a rifle length spring, so if it just needs a little bit of adjustment, then the Super 42 spring will be sufficient. And you can use the Super 42 rifle length spring in an A5 system with a standard buffer. The Super 42 system for carbine buffer tubes is going to rely on the Super 42 buffer. So no, you can't use the Super 42 carbine spring with your run-of-the-mill buffer. It has to specifically be carbine Super 42 buffer with carbine Super 42 spring. If you don't follow that, it's on you and you're gonna have a bad time. Lastly, with muzzle device selection. So muzzle devices are as subjective as optic reticles. There are guys that really prefer a specific suppressor with a specific muzzle device for when the suppressor's not on board. There are other guys that want to take as best care of their suppressor as possible, so they will only run a muzzle brake as it acts as a sacrificial baffle. I have heard people say that there's a little extra pressure on the sidewalls from the muzzle brake, which is entirely possible, and a muzzle brake is going to increase the back pressure a little bit more than running an open tine sort of muzzle device. So your Surefire flash hider or any sort of muzzle device that has a prong. Your Knight's 3-prong, all those other muzzle devices that I don't use because I don't have those suppressors. Just match the muzzle device with your intended outcome and whatever suppressor you plan to use in the future. I also recommend getting a rugged suppressor. Well, that's funny. I also really like ruggeds, but get a suppressor that you can use for a long time because you have to wait for it. You have to get an NFA tax stamp. So don't get a suppressor that you're just going to pay the tax stamp for, burn out, and it's done. You know, there's some less expensive suppressors. Try to avoid that. I will also say that for those that have not shot suppressed, shooting 1 round suppressed is like shooting 5 to 10 rounds unsuppressed. You're going to have a very dirty gun. So lubrication and maintenance is key. There's going to be guys that take a really filthy, unclean weapon out there and run it suppressed and have a bad time. Some guns can do it, some guns can't. I'm not saying that's absolutely going to happen, but it drastically increases the probability. And then because of that bad time due to lack of maintenance, people are gonna blame the suppressor or some other nonsense. So have a clean gun. Too much oil though. I tend to oil my barrels, and I keep my guns pretty wet because I go to the range in spurts. You know, there'd be 1 month I go 4 or 5 times, then a month I can't swing it or can't make it or whatever, and then the next month I go. So I tend to be a little generous with how much oil I put on there because I want the guns to be good to go in the safe. Plus there's a lot of humidity and salt down here, so I gotta protect my weapons. But make sure your weapon's properly serviced, not too much oil, and not zero oil. And definitely, I don't like dirty guns personally. I know some guys don't care, but I really don't like a dirty gun. Take care of your shit. It's expensive. Make sure, if you're brand new to this, have some sort of glove and pipe wrench that can take your suppressor off. If you get carbon lock, not all of them can be unlocked and shot off. So if you have a pipe wrench, you can put that around there, take it off without damaging your suppressor, good to go. Some guys will just leave it on there carbon locked, that's your business. It's harder to clean that way, but whatever. I do clean my suppressors after use. That's not necessarily something you have to do, but is encouraged if you don't have a flow through especially, and even the flow throughs can get clogged up full of shit, so it's up to you. And the last thing I'm gonna cover is, and this is something I struggled with at first because I'm always really ginger with other people's stuff, but make sure your suppressor is properly installed. So Surefire RC2, for instance, index it properly. It'll click on there, and then all the way down, make sure it's firm. It's gonna get very hot, and you do not want to touch these barehanded. You get like 3 or 4 rounds through them, they're already as hot as the barrel, and anything over that, it's gonna get really, really hot, really, really fast, like instant 1st and 2nd degree burns hot. So definitely do not handle these guns with the suppressors after you've been shooting barehanded. Pistol suppressors, every magazine or two, you want to check that they're still tight because you can have a baffle strike if it starts to back out. So if you're shooting suppressed, especially if it's a range day, it's really not that big a deal just to make sure it's tight as you shoot it. Some stay on there better than others, some don't, but it's important, especially if you're borrowing somebody else's stuff. Just enjoy the experience, shoot slow, make sure the can doesn't back off so you don't ruin your buddy's can. Important little items, hey, don't do these things. Also, don't set a hot suppressor on anything nylon. Wood is good, but it can catch on fire. So just try to keep the hot suppressor away from anything. And you'd be surprised, like paper targets under a suppressor can catch fire just because it's so hot, or they'll melt to it. I've seen people set it on a glove, and it's a thinner mechanics glove, not one that's really set up to deal with too much heat, and it'll burn to the suppressor. There's a lot of stuff that can happen. So these things do get super hot. It should be something that's common knowledge, but you'd be surprised. It's best just to lean it on the table, downrange, and leave the suppressor off to cool. Or set it on something so the suppressor's in the air and air can circulate around it, above it, you know, all that good stuff. Hopefully this random video finds you well. I know it's not gonna be for everybody, and I kind of rambled, and looking at how much memory's left, it's gonna be fun to edit.
Fuck.
Thanks for watching. Take care out there.